Okay, welcome everyone. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Mari Tyllinen, who is a doctoral candidate at Aalto University, that's in Finland. She's a visiting researcher here at UVic, and also a UX manager at an organization called Apapi in Finland. She's currently finishing her doctoral dissertation on measuring usability in public IP procurement, and she has a lot of great experience. In the year 2013 to 15, she was involved in the definition of all usability-related process and contractual requirements and planning and executing usability evaluation during a large-scale public IP procurement project. And after the system was selected, she's also been leading the usability and UX efforts at Apapi. Apapi organization is a publicly owned company that was responsible for implementing and selecting the system in Finland together with system vendors, and it currently maintains and develops the implementation further. And it has around 50,000 professional end users of the systems. And Mari's background is she has a Master's of Science in Computer Science from the Helsinki University of Technology in Finland. So with that, I will pass it to Mari.
Thank you, Andre. Sorry, I have some announcements on my screen that I have to click out of the way. Yes, so my topic today is the usability and UX in information system procurement, and this is a joint session for the seminar series and then also for the course. I'm going to go through these things in quite a, not going into much detail. I'll cover a lot of things and I don't have time to go into much detail, but some things. So Andre introduced me, so there's no need to go through this slide. Today, I'm going to be talking about why we should care about usability and UX in IS procurement. Then I'm going to go through some scope and definitions for today's presentation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the laws governing public procurement in Europe. Then going into the procurement process, where does usability actually fit into the process? And then to end with some of my thoughts on why procurement projects seem to be still failing the users in usability and UX after the implementation. So just in case not everyone has a background in what usability and UX mean, just these definitions. So there are several definitions for usability, but most commonly it's associated with the attributes of effectiveness, efficiency, satisfaction, learnability, memorability, and lack of errors. And then also when we think about usability, it's always important to think about the context of use, the users, their tasks and goals. So all those things need to be understood before you can say anything about usability for those users. And then if the term user experience is something more talked about maybe nowadays, and that is a bit maybe larger concept. It depends on who you ask whether usability is part of user experience or they're separate or whatever, but still it's the idea that the person's perceptions and responses, so everything from emotions and beliefs to physical responses to the system before, after, and during the use. So, and those are some references for these definitions in the below. So why does it matter? Why should we care about this thing? As you can sort of like maybe guess from the definitions, increasing usability of a system probably increases the likelihood of happy end users when the system is actually in use. And it's also thought that it would increase the productivity and efficiency of those end users. And then, of course, end users are more likely to achieve their goals or tasks with the system. And if the system is easy to use, then maybe the costs of training end users might be lower. And then if we specifically think about the procurement, why is it important in procurement to think about usability? Well, it's simply just too late, or then it might cost a lot to the organization if we postpone thinking about usability when the system is already selected or already in use. So some scope and definitions. So basically, if we think about procurement overall, there are obviously always two options. So you can be procuring a software project. So someone actually does the software from scratch to you based on your requirements as an organization. Or you could be procuring a already existing software from a vendor that you then might be able to configure afterwards. And then obviously the organizations can be different that are procuring and obviously like private organizations, but then they could be public or governmental organizations. And in my presentation, I will be concentrating on the procurement of existing systems and then the public aspect, public organizations. So those are sort of like important things to keep in mind when I talk about these things. So procurement is the earliest point for an organization that is going to use the system to affect its usability and UX. If we think about user-centered design or human-centered design, we talk about it in the context of actually developing the system. But if we are procuring existing systems, then the organization procuring the system isn't involved in the development from scratch. It's only involved from the point forward of selecting which system it will use in the future. Then here we have the sort of like the phases that are involved in procurement or public procurement. So it always like starts with requirement specification, regardless if we're talking about an existing system or if we are talking about developing systems. Then it goes into tendering and then the selection process, and the selection process can involve all sorts of things, negotiations, and then contracting phase, implementation, when you actually have selected the system and start implementing it, and then the completion of the procurement project. So that's sort of like a really long process that can take several years. For example, like Andre said, I've been working in Apotti, so if we think about this whole process, it has taken almost 10 years. But in my presentation, I will be focusing on the sort of like this part of the procurement process, so the tendering, the selection, and the contracting part. So in the European Union, there is very strict legislation governing procurement for public entities. So there's a directive, and then there's like all the member states have their national legislation, and in Finland it is this particular act on public procurement. And I'm pretty sure other countries have similar laws, but probably Canada has similar laws, but I'm not familiar with those. And I'm sure the details vary in those laws. In the European Union, the selection is based on finding the economically most advantageous tender. So that is a sort of like the quote from the law. And usually that can mean only the price, it can mean only the quality, or it can be a combination of the quality and the price. And it depends on the case how you are able to sort of like make the basis of which makes most sense for the particular procurement. So there are certain principles in the law that then we can thought that they affect the usability and UX work. So the law dictates that the process needs to be transparent. So all stakeholders, vendors, especially need to be aware of what are the sort of what are the selection rules, what is done, and on what basis is the selection done. Then also the vendors need to be treated equally. and you can sort of like discriminate certain vendors. So you can't decide which type of which vendor you might want to make the contract with before you start the negotiations and the actual procedure. And you can't, for example, make the tender, write the tender in a way that it would give preference to one vendor. And then also the law dictates that there must be measurable criteria for the selection, and they must be predetermined when you announce the tender. Then also other considerations that need to be taken into account when you plan the usability work during the procurement. So in the beginning, obviously there might be many systems. You don't really know how many systems will be interested in tendering in the process. Then also the systems that will tender usually are not known to the usability people or the people in the procurement project that will be planning the usability evaluations or other considerations during the procurement. Usually there are limited resources and tight schedules in the procurement project. Then, as I said, there is the strictly regulated process that needs to be followed. And then also, if we think about planning, for example, usability evaluations, then the level of the information system maturity should be taken into consideration. So what type of evaluations can you actually do? So then to the phases of the procurement process, or the tendering and selection process. So basically this is sort of the phases of the process, and all those violet ones are when the actual process starts from the legislative perspective. So there's the contract notice, and then you can do some sort of pre-eliminations, and you can invite to tender, and then the process goes on. What is important in this process is that this is the point in which you need to specify those criteria, like I said before, that what is actually the selection basis. And then this is the point in which you actually usually know about how much it's going to cost. So that is sort of like a special thing about public procurement in the legislation, that you can't negotiate on the price of the system. Usually you might have a vague idea what it's going to cost, but you really don't know until you receive the offer. So quite in the end. So the law has different types of procurement, and these are the types of procurement that are sort of relevant for this when you're procuring existing systems. So there's an open procedure and a restricted procedure, and these are simpler processes, so they don't go through all the phases in the previous slide. You can't use negotiations in these processes. And then also you need to have the final requirements before you actually announce the call for tender. Then there's the negotiated procedure, which gives more flexibility. So the requirement specification needs to be done before you actually put out the call for tender, but it can be negotiated on. And you can negotiate on a lot of the terms of the contract with the vendors. And then you can also have like stages in the process where you reduce the number of vendors during the negotiations based on the criteria. But the criteria, once again, need to be presented beforehand before going into the process. And then there's the fourth type, which is a competitive dialogue, where you actually negotiate about the solutions to meet the needs. And in this process, this is the only type, one of those like these processes where you can actually have some leeway of negotiating about the price once you have selected the system. So only types 3 and 4 can include these like traditional procurement practices where you could, for example, demonstrate the system or see other ways how to evaluate the products. So what is important in the beginning is to set the criteria and goals for the usability. As always with usability, you need to sort of like identify the main user groups, and you need to know the use contexts, and then you need to know the tasks of these user groups. But it's important to define the objectives of usability for these user groups for the procurement and based on the usability attributes. So here is an example, which is from a paper that I've written, that you sort of like divide the groups into professionals, and then you might have like different kinds of professionals, but in this case you have 3 types of professionals, citizens, and you have sort of like put those goals of the procurement there: improved efficiency, effectiveness, reduced number of errors once you have taken the system into use, and then you sort of like, those are the usability goals, and then you have the goals of the procurement in the sort of like overall goals, and then how do these usability goals go and sort of like get to the like the end result that the procurement has. Yeah, so sorry, losing my words here a bit. Well, then I'm going to be going through some of the ways in which to actually include usability in procurement. So one of the ways obviously is the first phase, the requirements definition. So there can be different kinds of requirements that are related to usability. And user requirements are usually thought about as functional requirements, but obviously they do affect also the users if we talk about what the users can do with the system. Then there are more traditional usability requirements, so they are called or part of the non-functional requirements, and they complement the functional requirements. So they can sort of like include those more qualitative aspects of the system, but they still, to be effective, they can't be like this written like the system must be easy to use, because that doesn't actually mean anything. So they need to be verifiable, they need to be valid, and they need to be comprehensive, and it's good to have like target values in the requirements to actually make them testable and to see if you actually fulfill the requirements, or the system fulfills the requirements. And then there can also be like process requirements for the implementation. So you can have user-centered design requirements and requirements on the usability testing. And these sort of like these requirements are important for the actual contract, but they are also important if we think about doing usability evaluation during the procurement. So you can sort of like base the evaluations on these requirements. So in general, in public procurement, you can have several qualitative criteria which you base the decisions on. And usability or user experience can be one of those criteria. The sort of like the requirement for a criteria to be included in the public procurement is that it needs to be measurable. And there can be different ways of doing the measuring of usability during the procurement. So some of the ways, typical ways, might be meeting of requirements. So you could sort of like score the vendor when they sort of like agree to meet the requirements. Then you can also sort of like evaluate how they have developed the system. You can assess the expertise of the vendors on usability and user-centered design, for example. And then you can compare the systems, actually go into detail and actually do see the systems in action, because all those other things are only based on what the vendors say and not actual seeing it for yourself. So like I said, the process can include stages, and you can sort of like also in the usability, you can sort of like think of it that you can do several phases. So you can have a first phase where you eliminate those systems which, for example, don't reach a minimal level of usability, or you can sort of like rank the systems based on the usability criteria, and then state beforehand that you can only admit the 2 best ones, for example. Well, actually, you can't say that because you need to have at least 3, sorry, in public procurement, that's in the law. But you can sort of like say that only 3 systems can be admitted to the second phase. And then in the second phase, you can actually measure the quality and then have those measures affect the selection in the final decision. So effectively, what this means for usability is that you are doing summative usability evaluation where you want to gather quantitative data, which means measuring the usability metrics for those usability attributes of efficiency and effectiveness and satisfaction. And there can be different measures for this. For example, task completion time can sort of like measure the efficiency. You can have task success rate, which is quite typical for effectiveness. You can have satisfaction questionnaires. And the aim here is in summative usability evaluation is to compare the results, usually between different versions of the same system or between systems. And this differs from formative usability evaluation, which focuses on qualitative data, which is usually done during the product development and to support the development and pick on the usability issues and then correcting those issues. So in the procurement, you can basically choose as many or as few usability aspects into the selection as you see appropriate for your procurement. So this is also always dependent on what is important for the users and for this system and so on. Obviously, like usually you can't argue that effectiveness isn't important, but so like how many of these you actually need. I won't go through this here, but you can see the slides later if you want to look at them in more detail. Then here is an excellent framework that we've been using also I've been using in my research. So it's sort of like puts the traditional usability evaluation method or usability ways of evaluating usability into this continuum of evidence on usability. And like usually in procurement, you can have like vendor demonstrations, but there are ways to make them better using these sort of clinical processing scenarios. Or then you can like have your heuristic evaluation, usability testing, and so on. And best always to actually see the usability is to see the on-site analysis. Here's an example of how you could implement these methods into a procurement process. So you could sort of like select some methods for the first phase where you actually want to just eliminate the systems to have like few of them. And then you can use some of the methods for the shortlist evaluation where you have fewer systems. Then the thing about this evaluation is that the results need to be quantified to actual score in a public procurement. So, and there are options. You can either treat usability as one criterion. So you need one score for usability. So if you have several attributes that you have used to measure the usability, then you need to figure out how to put them into one score. Or you can treat each usability attribute as a separate criteria. So equal them to the other criteria that you might have in the procurement process. Generally, research on usability promotes treating those attributes as separate from each other. So there isn't much research on actually doing those sort of like one unified score. There is some, but not much. But regardless of which you choose to sort of like think about this problem, they sort of like both these approaches in public procurement lead to the same problem. How do you actually weigh these attributes in relation to each other? So is effectiveness as important as efficiency, and as important as satisfaction? Or do they actually have like separate weights compared to each other? Or are they similar? And how do you actually come to this conclusion? And this is something I touch upon in my dissertation. I won't go into more detail here, but this is essentially it's both a problem of thinking about it, but also it's a problem of it's a mathematical problem of how to then do it in a way that it's predictable what the end result is. And some literature discusses this on a general level regarding weighing the different criteria in procurement overall. So it is definitely not as easy as it might seem. Then one of the ways to include usability is the request for proposals and the contract at the end of the or near the end of the selection process. So essentially, like I said, the request for proposal becomes the contract with the vendor that you select in most types of procurement. Only in the last type you can have some actual discussion after you have made the selection. From a usability perspective, you should always include at least these things in the contract. So have user requirements, obviously, have usability requirements, have those process requirements, and then testing requirements, so that those govern how you do then the implementation project, or how the vendor does it, depending on what the contract actually states, who does what. And this is also a question of who is actually responsible for the final end result after the implementation. Is it the vendor or is it the procurer? And who should take the responsibility? Ultimately, I think the responsibility should lay with the procurer in a way that they govern how the usability work should be done. Then I'm coming to an end in my presentation. I think I haven't really used as much time as I could have, but some thoughts in the end on why do we end up with systems with dissatisfied users? Because that seems to be the problem still, that at least in health informatics, doctors are not happy with the systems and other professional groups are not happy with the systems that they are using. So, well, the first thing that I tried to tackle here in this presentation was that the selected system wouldn't have poor usability, but it might be that the selected system isn't very usable, actually. And this might be because there were no usability criteria at all during the selection, so the selection was only based on, for example, the price. Or if they actually included these criteria in the selection, it might not have substantial weight compared to the other criteria. So you could have the weights in a way in the procurement that actually you end up with a solution that is still always the cheapest, for example, and the other criteria might not have any effect actually because their weights compared to the price are so small, for example. Then the implementation project might fail to account for usability. So maybe there were no user-centered design requirements for the implementation method, or if they were, they weren't followed in a very broad way, for example. Or then we come to the the ultimate problem with especially large and complex systems. There are always competing priorities. So usually those competing priorities in a IT project are schedule and resources, and very often those things outweigh the quality in the decision makers' heads. And then one problem with especially like health informatics systems that are like very complex is that there are competing goals. The user groups might have competing goals with each other, and how to then weigh those against each other in the implementation, it might not be easy. Then one of the reasons might be that the organizational change is not led and managed appropriately. So having a new system is always a shock to the users. It's always different than what they are used to. And the thing to think about is not using the system is not the work that they want to do. They want to do their work, and then the system is only a tool for them. So they are not perhaps thinking about the system in the similar way that someone who purchased the system might be thinking about the system. For example, from a reporting perspective, that all of these things need to be reported, and then that is not sort of like managed, and that is not communicated to the users why these things might be important. So they see the tool from their own perspective only. And then obviously, if the system is a bit more complex to use, as professional systems usually are, so you can't really expect to have a complex professional system that the users can use without training. And then the question is, how much are they trained? Can they have time to actually participate in the training? Or do they have other competing priorities within their work? So yeah, these are my thoughts. And then I have, at the end, I have some references and reading if someone is more interested in some of these things. So thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks a lot, Mary. That was excellent. A very useful presentation. I know I have a whole bunch of questions, and